Welcome back to the Benefit Podcast, bringing you everything you need to know about living your best life. And this one it might have caused you a little bit of intrigue by the title. It's something that I'm going to refer to as involved dads. Now, this is a little bit like what we often hear working mums referred to. I think with dads, it can often be very difficult. And I don't want to take anything away from mums, by the way. Like, the purpose of me recording this isn't to say that we shouldn't mention them. What I often think happens when a woman becomes a mother, when they have that child, I think very commonly they become mum first, and then career, for example, is a little bit secondary. And I think that's why you almost get that like working mums reference that comes in. You know, mum gets a lot of the maternity leave, and I understand why. Again, I'm not saying that they shouldn't. Mum gets a lot of the maternity leave, and I think in today's society more and more women are more career focused. So I'm not saying that it's very much like very traditionally, you know, going back probably not even that long, to be honest, 20, 30, 50, 60 years, it was very much that the woman stayed at home to look after the children and the man went out to provide for the family. That was just a very stereotypical way that things were done. And I do think society is changing, and I do think it's changing for the better. I think there are a lot more women that are more career focused. I think there are a lot more fathers who are more prepared to be stay-at-home dad or work part-time or be much, much, much more involved in their children's lives than maybe was the case 40, 60, 70 years ago. And like I said, I think that's a really positive change. I still don't think the dad side of things gets as much sort of focus and attention. You know, I think there's a huge conversation that gets had around working mums and, you know, women in careers. And again, as I will keep reiterating, I'm not saying that we shouldn't keep like talking about that and we shouldn't keep encouraging that. But I think it can just mean sometimes dads can get a little bit lost in those conversations. You know, I think it is still quite taboo to be a stay-at-home dad. I think that just is a topic that's almost, you know, frowned upon if someone was to ask the question, like, you know, what do you do? And there's an expectation from a man's point of view that they go out to work. And in many cases, there's also the expectation that they're the main breadwinner. You know, it's not necessarily just that they go to work, it's that they've got the main job that supports the majority of the household income. That's quite a big pressure that comes on men to do that. You know, and I think for some people, they absolutely thrive in that. I think there's very much something to be said about playing or taking on that like protector provider role. Like, I do think that's quite an important thing, and it's something that I feel bound to a little bit myself. It's not necessarily the way that right now Lara and I share our responsibilities. You know, she has the job, you know, she's got the employed role, she goes into the city a couple of times a week, and I probably do take on a little bit more of the parenting role in you know, particularly on those days. You know, she has to be up early, she gets home a little bit later. That means there is more emphasis on me on those days to be the dad. But I relish that, you know, and it always makes me think about, I mean, I left the finance world, you know, almost 10 years ago now, and while back then I wasn't necessarily thinking about starting a family. You know, if I think back to the kind of hours that I was doing in that job, I'd have barely seen my kids. That's just how it was. You know, like, there were several points within a year where I would be working 70, 80, 100-hour weeks. You know, that was a relatively frequent occurrence. It was rare that I would work less than 50 or 60 hours a week. And you know, that would have meant that I would have been much less available to be part of my child's life. And that isn't something that I ever wanted to find myself in. Like, I do feel very, very fortunate right now that I'm in the position I'm in. You know, I do have a little bit more flexibility. I do work from home full time. I am able, should I need to be the one that can go and pick Louis up if he's not feeling very well, or, you know, Lara and I can share those responsibilities that much more because I'm at home full time and she's at home 60% of the time. So it becomes a much easier thing to deal with. But I also think the the conversation around involved dads still doesn't really happen to the level that I believe it should, it could, and it needs to. I think there's certain pockets that are doing much more to talk about it. Like I've been involved in a couple of podcasts recently, one very, very much like dad focused. There's a big movement, particularly in the UK, to improve and increase the amount of paternity leave that dads get, because the current situation of 2 weeks simply isn't enough. Like 2 weeks to be at home with your child, children, and your partner, you're barely adjusting to anything. Like there's not enough time to bond, and it's really, really difficult. In France, where I live, like that is 28 days. But all of these are also very much for the employed. The self-employed don't get the same benefits, or at least not that I'm aware of. The state aren't going to fund my 2, 4, 6, 9 months or whatever it is by paying me all of the money that they might. And even if they were to pay me the money, I wouldn't have a business left. If I just didn't do anything for 6 months, 9 months, to be honest, if I didn't do anything for a couple of weeks, a month, I wouldn't have a business. And again, like that's the choice I've made. And there'll be people saying, well, your business isn't set up right, etc., etc., etc. People can say what they want. But the point I'm making is more needs to be done. It's not taking that away from mothers, because I don't think that's the thing to do either. Like I'm not saying that we should, if fathers were to suddenly get 9 months of paternity leave, that women should only get a month's worth of maternity leave. That's not what I'm saying at all. I think there's actually much more importance on the family unit being together in those situations, especially, with a newborn child. Again, anyone who's had children will appreciate that in those newborn stages in particular, you don't know what the fuck you're doing. Like, especially if it's your first child, everything's brand new. You're firefighting at every situation. You're sleep deprived. You're exhausted. You could be dealing, as we were, with the fact that, Lara went through a really traumatic birth. And so it's not just about trying to look after our son. It's also trying to make sure that she's okay. And all of that was happening whilst I was still having to work. We were in hospital for a week post-birth because Lara needed the support and the recovery. And I was coming backwards and forwards. I was working, I was back. It was a really, really difficult time. And I don't think a lot of this gets spoken about. And even then, as the child gets older, again, I think there is probably more expectation that dad does just go off back to work after a very short period of time. Dad continues to be the breadwinner. Whereas, there is, in some ways and in some situations, there's probably less pressure on a woman to go back to work, or there's more allowance for that to be back to work on a part-time basis, for example. I just think that a lot of the time dads can get a little bit lost in these conversations. And in some ways it feels like it diminishes the role of dad, which it absolutely shouldn't. Like, having both parental figures, in my opinion, and again, I've been very fortunate to grow up with both of my parents still together after many, many years of marriage. I know that's not the case for everyone, but to have a strong male and female role model in a child's life, I think is a really important thing. So I just wanted to get a bit of stuff off my chest probably, but also open that dialogue. If you are, and I'm not saying that I only want to speak to dads here either, because I'm sure there's going to be lots of mums that have got very strong opinions on this stuff either way. It might be that actually you are very strongly of the opinion that dad should go back to work and he should do what he needs to do, and it should be mum that stays at home. You might be the complete opposite. You might be a dad who's very in favour of going out to work and being that person. And equally, you might be the complete opposite. I would love to speak to people. I think it's something that we need to talk about more. Men are very, very, have a tendency not to talk about stuff. And if this just sparks a bit of a conversation, that would be absolutely fantastic. And if you do want to have a chat, please do feel free. Comment wherever you're watching or listening to this. send me a message at Ben Howard Fitness on any of my socials, pop me an email, ben@benhowardfitness.com. Always happy to have these discussions because I think they're important ones to have. And I'll be back very soon with another episode.